Welcome everyone to this webinar of Markus Krebsz, organized by the International Neural Network Society. And before I go and introduce into the topic, just to mention the International Neural Networks Society organizes regularly these webinars, 1 or 2 a month, and you can see what's going on under the website INNS.org. And this webinar here is being recorded, and the availability, or you can watch it later also on YouTube. The topic of today is a very exciting one. Maybe you remember last webinar we had more or less this welcome screen here about the guidelines on trustworthy AI. And these are not the only guidelines around. Actually, there is a world map of guidelines and policies everywhere, like 82 in the US, 63 in Europe, and in each country, even a few more. In the UK, also more than 60. So people are getting actually very confused about all of these guidelines. And I have always this question, we have also a working group here in Sweden on how do we actually practically work with these guidelines? What can we do? How can we have actually something, maybe a framework making sense of these guidelines? Specifically, not from a AI specialist, but also from a practitioner's, risk manager's perspective. And it would be really great to have such a framework. And the answer is we do have one. And who is better in presenting that than the maker of that by himself, Markus Krebsz. Markus Krebsz was already involved in policy making development, for example, for the United Nations. He was speaking to the 193 member states. He's working also in academia and industry, like many of our speakers. He is working in Stirling University and Woxsen University. And he is involved in so many startups and scale-ups that I will not list them all now, but he really has a lot of practical experience. And this experience made him also being able and participate in many different activities for policy making when he was working in this area already for decades. And he is very proud of presenting today a practical framework making sense of these policies. It's called EW-AiRM. What that stands for, the title of today, we will see in a moment, and we will see now, I'm very much looking forward to that, a tasting menu of this frameworks. Please, Markus, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much. First of all, whilst I get my slides up, if I can, I would like to say very much thank you for your kind introduction, Markus. Thank you also so much to my dear friend Nicola Fabiano for his kind introduction to INNS and for inviting me today to speak. And then finally also a huge thank you to the International Neural Network Society for having me today. Now, following on from Markus's introduction, my background is, I guess, probably an outlier, a little bit weird, and maybe somewhat different to the people you usually have joining you for these kind of sessions. And today's topic is about a framework that probably sort of crystallized over the last, I say, 6 months or so, but in its making goes back at least to 2020, actually goes back further, it goes back to 2013/16. And I'll give you a bit an idea of the origins in a minute. Now, I'll call this framework enterprise-wide AI risk management, a practical framework for managing AI risks across organizations. And rather than coming up with a fancy title or some sort of fancy acronym, it's actually exactly what it is. It's enterprise-wide AI risk management. Now, before I come to that, I'd like to tell you a little bit about myself and then also give you a bit of an origin story of how all of this developed. So my background is almost 35 years probably in banking and financial markets, capital markets, credit rating agencies. I've done a lot of work with institutions such as the World Bank, the IMF, also individual governments. I was the chief risk officer for the UK Municipal Bonds Agency, which was a banking startup for the UK government, local government, not central government, but yet it still exists. It's very important. I put the whole risk management framework in place. My background is a practitioner. Yes, I do some academic work, but the reason why the universities usually pull me in is because they actually want to find out more how it's done in practice and how things are being implemented rather than coming up with the theories. That said, I guess I could classify myself a little bit as a framework guy. You can see here two paradigms I developed. The first one was the global conduct risk paradigm, sort of 2015, 16, which was a result of the Financial Conduct Risk Authority coming in play in the UK in 2013. This is all about behavioral economics, finance, but also how behavior compliance or non-compliance, misconduct influences behavior in banks and then sort of regulatory implications. That was then followed in 2017 by what I called the universal conduct risk paradigm, which covers everything else other than banks and financial institutions. So, universally applicable and still available on the United Nations website if you wanted to find it. And I can provide you the links also if you reach out to me. That was then followed later by some of the work I've done for Unit C. Unit C is the United Nations Economic Commission for Europe, which is a little bit misleading because it actually covers a much bigger area, much more different countries than just Europe. In fact, 193 member states are part of some of these working groups. And I came up with what I called back then HIPACA, which is the human AI paradigm for ethics, conduct, and risk. You can see there's a little bit of a theme here. Very strong risk, very strong on conduct, but increasingly also AI coming into play. And I'll tell you a little bit more why that is. So from a practical perspective, probably for the last, 12, maybe longer years, I've also been playing around with AI drones, such as this one. If you think, how can that fly? Actually, it can. It's here. This is the very same that's on the picture. That's called a V-copter. It's very interesting because the algorithm controls the motor movement and by that keeps it relatively stable. It means you need less energy and so on. Also, much smaller drones such as the 00 Robotics hover here. So I've been playing around with these tools and been trying to understand how AI actually influences real life activities. And I guess the culmination of all of this work was the common regulatory arrangement and then declaration for Unit C in the United Nations that was put in place, and tell you a little bit more about the origin story and how this then led me ultimately into enterprise-wide AI risk management for enterprises, commercial, corporates, organizations, and so on. So today, very lightweight overview. There's a lot of pictures going to be, there's a lot of information, I suppose, as well. But the nice thing is all of this is going to be recorded. The INNS will make it available on YouTube so you can go back and listen in if you miss some of these things. Now, this is the kind of things I'd like to touch at least a little bit on. And I think Markus at the beginning was talking about a menu or tasting menu. This is really some tasters of what this is all about. So back in 2020, as part of EW-AiRM, which is a group I've been part of since 2012-13 that focused specifically on the risk of regulatory systems, I became increasingly concerned and involved also what I call AI-NR tech, which is artificial intelligence, neurotechnology, and robotics, and the interaction of all of these devices with human life. So I was focusing on products and later on also services with embedded AI systems, particularly from this perspective of autonomy, being mindful that autonomy means an AI system that is fully capable of modifying its operating domain and then also interacting. But also that means, from my perspective, it's a prerequisite for agency, which I saw also increasing as part of all these products and services that are popping up, and meaning the capacity of an AI system to act autonomously, make decisions that achieve specific goals, and then interact with its surroundings and the environment. But that goes further because we're not only talking about the physical environment, we're also talking about virtual environments. And I'm involved with an organization, still a startup, which is called the Scubaverse. It does a lot of work with the United Nations, and the idea is turning coral reefs into 3D geospatial models and then using them for all sorts of educational purposes, virtual tourism, and so on. So there's an overlap here between the physical world and the virtual environments. And that also means these products and services may use things like persuasion to influence and change human thinking, decisions, behaviors, and actions. And ultimately, from my perspective, it was always important that AI systems should not be able to override human control. Why? I hear you ask now. Now, my other concern in relation to this, and one of the initial quests back in 2020 for developing this United Nations AI Declaration, was really about how do we need to be mindful that both the increasing autonomy and the increasing agency of AI systems wouldn't sort of reduce human control to a point where the tail risk becomes very thick. So you will be familiar with thin and thick tails, and you're going to see this visual in a minute. My dear friend Nassim Nicholas Taleb, in his book Anti-Fragile, and then also in The Black Swan, which we talk a little bit about in a minute, AI Black Swans, is very concerned about these thick and thin tails. And in terms of the AI agency and the AI autonomy, I'm thinking of this a little bit simplified in these four quadrants. Bearing in mind, I'm saying status quo here. This was in 2020, my thinking. So we have moved, I think, already quite a bit beyond that. But the status quo was there was a relatively low agency, relatively low autonomy of AI systems, and as such, it's probably worth monitoring and researching, but we shouldn't be too concerned about it. Now, as the agency increases, the cost of AI advances and innovation, we need to balance them carefully to protect our freedoms. And we've probably seen that in 2021, 2022, as an outfall maybe also of COVID and some of the digitalization of human life. So AI agency increases, autonomy still relatively low. But now, when we think about human oversight and control, and autonomy also increases, we need to be mindful that this whole area needs to be somehow regulated in risk management, because if it's not, that last quadrant, in my mind, reflects a potential risk for the loss of human control. And if we talk about humanity's tail risk, you can see here, the bigger that tail risk becomes in the end and moves towards loss of human control, that's when we need to be mindful. And that's probably what some of the big tech pros are concerned when they're talking about AGI. Although I think a lot of it is still hyped up because they have to sell their products. They need to make money, a lot of money. And that brings me to the evolving digital regulation of goods and AI landscape. You can see here the work I've done for the UN and Unit C in particular, Working Party 6, was really a three-phase project. The first 2 years, from November 2020 until February 22, were roughly focusing on what I would call research of AI and our tech, so the artificial intelligence, neurotechnology, and robotics, the whole landscape of standards, frameworks, the mapping that were out there, and Markus at the introduction put up that map. So that map now would look considerably different than what the map used to look like back then. There was a lot of blank space. There was a lot of development work needed. And obviously, we've seen a lot of other frameworks popping up in the meantime. We've seen the NISC risk management framework, we've seen the ISO 42000, and all of these have played in quite a bit into the work I've done for the UN. But then I was tasked by first EW-AiRM, which is a subgroup within Working Party 6, to develop this framework for regulatory compliance of initially products and then also later services with embedded AI systems. And if you think about services with embedded AI systems, you've got Microsoft here now that comes with Copilot. You've got mobile phones now that come with built-in embedded AI systems. You've got things like these drones that use with AI, although that's more like pattern recognition, to be honest, than anything else. And you've got other devices such as, I've got one behind me, is the Rapid R1, which is basically a new device that taps into the cloud, uses different kind of models, multi-agent models, and then solves based on the query and the prompt you submit to it. So there's a lot of development going on, and we will see these things popping up all the time, I guess. Now, that then brings me to the work I did for the UN, and I think that's the last slide on this. This is just a sort of summary. So in 2023, 2024, the UN, authored by me, developed by me, was a regulatory compliance of products with embedded AI systems and other digital technologies. That culminated then in the adoption by the 193 member states and overarching principles on the compliance of these products. And also, maybe something I'm most proud of, the Unit C then added this digital regulation and AI subpage to their website, which is basically a culmination and a summary of all the policy development work in this space that was done over time. Governments, agencies can become signatories to this AI declaration and the common regulatory arrangement, and they have done already. I'd like to see more of them signing up over time, and that is work that continues now, formalized by the UN Secretariat. But it's there, and it's nice to look back. This, as Markus said at the beginning, this was 5 years pro bono work. In fact, it goes back to 2020, 2013, when I first joined up with Unit C GRM. Very honored and proud to be able to do this kind of stuff. And you think about, how is this going to potentially influence? Well, but the UN has got 193 member states. They could, in theory, maybe not the US right now, but all the others could, in theory, sign up to all of these declarations and the common regulatory arrangement right now. The only two things it doesn't include, well, there's two things it doesn't include. One is autonomous vehicles. Sorry, wheel-driven vehicles, so autonomous cars, autonomous drones are included, autonomous submarines would be included as well. Cars not, the reason for that being there's a separate UN directive. And the other thing is autonomous weapons of all kinds would not be included, because that's something that the UN wanted to work on over the last few years. However, there's been quite a bit political pushback, understandably, I guess, to where we currently are from a geopolitical perspective. And also, this is part of national defense strategies. Everything else, apart from wheel-driven autonomous cars, and autonomous weapons is included. And if you think about it, this declaration, in theory, would apply to, I guess, more than 8 billion people around the globe. So that's pretty big, and it's kind of mind-boggling if you think about it as well. But it is what it is. It's where we are, and I'm quite proud. It's a signpost that's out there. But that then made me think, okay, where do we go next? Because the governments and the government agencies, relevant authorities, they are the regulators. That's fine. But we also should be worrying about the other end of the stick, which is the regulated entities, basically any organization that uses AI in one shape or another. And this, let me then think a little bit about AI adoption and enterprise-wide AI risk management as the commercial angle to this whole piece. Now, the interesting thing is I introduced this first as part of a Risk Europe 2025 keynote in London. And when I did that, I asked the audience the question because I wanted to understand how many of them, or their organizations more specifically, are already using artificial intelligence, and how many of them have actually robust AI risk management tools or framework in place. Now, interestingly enough, and shockingly, but maybe unsurprisingly as well, 95% of enterprises ask at that event, deploy AI already, and if they're not, they're certainly seriously considering it. In contrast to that, none of them, and that kind of shocked me, but didn't really surprise me, none of them have actually a robust AI risk management framework in place. And to me, that was the best confirmation, the most visible confirmation that there is a real need for enterprise-wide AI risk management. Now, I should say most organizations, in particular when I come from the banking and financial market sector, organizations have got risk management frameworks in place, the traditional ones. When I talk about enterprise risk management, I'm thinking of things like COSO, ISO 31000, or maybe even OSEC, the integrated risk management frameworks. These are all things that have been established, some of them good 10, 15 years back, going back to the financial crisis or even before that, to be honest. But none of them are specifically looking at the risks that are in relation to use of AI within these organizations. So that confirmed to me, yes, there's a need. We need to do something about this. But, and I think that's the important thing here, we shouldn't reinvent existing enterprise risk management frameworks. They are still needed. What we have to do is, and this is sort of my 2025 thinking now, what we have to do is instead, we have to augment the existing approaches because, frankly, you can't just go rip out existing enterprise risk management frameworks and completely start from scratch and embed them new. That's not going to work for a variety of reasons because you haven't got, or the firms haven't got the capacity to do all of that. You haven't got the resources, you haven't got the money, you haven't got the people who are able of doing it. You can't just change an organization from the ground up. So the only way I think this is going to work. And I'm working currently with a couple of organizations in different sectors, not banking, financial institutions, interestingly, other ones, to see how it's actually practically implementable. Now, this kind of was the first part of this presentation. This was the origin story of how we got to where we now from an enterprise-wide risk management perspective. Now I want to talk about what, in my mind, this whole framework looks like. Bearing in mind, I'm not reinventing the wheels. The wheels are already here, as you can see. I'm augmenting existing approaches and I'm tapping into tools and approaches that are already out there. So let's start. Let's lift the layer back here and see what this multi-layered approach of EW-AiRM in my mind looks like. And it's taken me a while to sort of come back full circle because you can see the hypacker that I mentioned early on in there as well, which represents an ethics filter, and I'll come back to that in a minute. But what I realized is the work I've done over the last 10, 14 years maybe for the UN was very valuable for me to develop the idea how this can work for an enterprise. Now, the way this works is It's this multi-layered approach, and I've used deliberately also the colors here, the red, amber, green, because in my mind, you need to start at the board level with an organization. You need to start where the strategy and the risk appetite is being set. And then you sort of move down into much more agile, dynamic area, which is the amber, the operational layer, what I call the engine room of enterprise-wide risk management. But then we also need to worry a little bit about what's happening when things are going wrong, what's happening with unpredictable events, and that's where the resilience layer is coming into play. So let's peel this a little bit apart and look first at a strategic layer level. I need to think about key foundational pillars, and I'm going to break those down in a minute on the next slide, what the components of those are. But that's not good enough because that's the board of the organization, the leadership, the management body deciding whether or not they want to have AI and how they use it. That is then complemented by this operational layer. Now, importantly, the operational layer uses the existing ERM framework, and I've used a couple here. So you can see that colorful cube, which is the COSO ERM cube. In 2017, that had a revision, and it became this very rainbow-like chart. I don't quite like that. I like the cube idea because it sort of compartmentalizes what currently traditional ERM looks like in an organization. And the other chart is the ISO 31000, which many of you may be familiar with, but that's not good enough. We need to augment this to become suitable for the current AI world. And what I tap into here, and I'll tell you in a minute why, is the MIT AI Risk Taxonomy and the MIT Risk Control Mitigations Framework. But again, in my mind, that's not good enough. That's operationalizing it. It's the engine room. We need to add to that. We need to think about the AI black swans and what that means from a risk management perspective. So that in a nutshell, it's my current thinking about EW-AiRM. And now I'm going to break this down further into the individual components. Let's look at the strategic layer first, these key foundational pillars. These are considerations that need to be done at a board level, and they need to align the strategy across the organization if they want to get this right. And one way to start that, it needs to start with a necessity assessment and a needs assessment, because frankly, there may be some organizations that are feeling like they're coming under pressure because everyone else is doing everything AI and they have to do the same thing right now, when realistically, what's the problem that you want to solve, and do you need AI to solve it not so solve it or not? So these are the kind of considerations that need to be done. But then it goes further, because if you give the green light at board level, that you say, okay, we want to do things now differently. We want to do things with AI, and bearing in mind this may impact the workforce at a global level. And we've seen organizations coming out last year saying, "Oh, we're doing everything AI now, and we're making 5,000 people redundant." And then 5 months later, they came back and said, "Actually, AI isn't doing for us what we wanted it to do. Now, please, everyone, come back." So that's the organizational readiness assessment. And very much hand in glove, what ties in with that is also the data and the technological maturity. Because frankly, you can't just put whatever AI engine or whatever LLM or whatever it is onto your systems, onto your framework, and make it run. Because if you haven't got sufficient data quality, data availability, the latency of the information, the frequency, the granularity, and all these things that come and making you a data mature or unmature organization, then you want to achieve nothing else, because AI, certainly in my mind, is a tool, a very powerful tool potentially, but also a very destructive tool if you're getting this wrong. So you need to think this through before you're giving the go-ahead at board level and making the decision to move ahead with this. This then means you have to think about from a risk tolerance, from a risk appetite, and from a prioritization perspective, because if all of a sudden you're now coming along with a big massive AI implementation project, you will be taking a lot of resources from a lot of organizational departments to doing different stuff. And that means massive interruption. And you also need to think about what messages are you sending to your workforce and what that means. Finally, or at that lower level, you also need to think about, how do I actually govern that? Have I got a AI policy in place? Unlikely, so I have to write one. Have I got AI processes in place? Unlikely, so I have to develop all of these. I need to think about the workflow, but that also means you should begin with the end in mind, and you should think about through the life cycle of the AI system, monitoring and adaptability, because frankly, these things are changing so quickly. They are not like an old, I don't know, C++ system or COBOL system that you would have implemented and that would have run happily in your bank to do the P&L or do some of the finance and the accounts. This is very, very different and very dynamic. It changes very quickly and it's got a massive, big impact on your operations. And then finally, this is where Hypacker comes into play. You need to overlay this with what I call the final ethical filter, because you need to think about from a digital ethics perspective, we can do it technically, but should we actually be doing it? You need to think about conduct risk and the conduct risk perspective, how the AI will likely incentivize or disincentivize human behavior and interact with your workforce. And then finally, can you actually explain the black box? You might not be able to explain the black box as such, but you need to be able to explain what goes in, what happens to it, when it comes out. And I've seen now increasing references in the market where organizations are actually thinking about developing AI, but in a white box system that allows you complete explainability, trustworthiness, auditability. So these things from an ethical filter perspective are actually very, very important. That's the strategic layer. Okay. So the next one then is, if I want to take my existing enterprise-wide risk management framework and augment that to overcome the traditional ERM challenges that organizations had to grapple with, the only way I really can do this or think about doing it is I need to augment it with something rather than just completely replacing it. And my thinking is, and my approach is, there may be others that say, actually, why don't you use the NIST risk management framework? I very much like the MIT AI Risk Taxonomy. The reason for this, it's very well researched. It had an update coming out in December 2025. Initially, I think it was 63 global risk management frameworks, AI risk frameworks that contributed to that. Now it was upgraded. It's 74. It includes a database of 1600 plus AI risks and two taxonomies. A causal taxonomy, which is about how, when, and why is there any risk caused by AI. The important one for me is this domain taxonomy, which is based on this work. It's peer-reviewed, is taking a lot of research and input from the MIT Future Tech team to get to this point. And they made all of this available. You can go there, you can get the repository, you can get the mitigations and control framework, you can get this list of 1600 AI risks and the full domain and just implement it, augment what's there within the organization and just use it. To me, that becomes the operational layer. It's the engine room of enterprise-wide AI risk management. And it looks as follows. So this is the 7 domains currently, and then the 24 subdomains. It was 23 last year, and then it was extended by MIT, I think, worthwhile extension to include multi-agent risks. Now you can see already, if you're familiar with some of the traditional ERM frameworks, things such as socioeconomic and environmental harms previously in these traditional, more classic frameworks have not really been considered. Misinformation, discrimination, and toxicity. So the whole discussion around bias has not been considered. But also nicely, it includes things such as fraud, scams, and targeted manipulation and cyber attacks. So there is cyber-related risks that are closely linked to AI, potential AI risks and black AI swans that are also included in this taxonomy. From my perspective, it's worthwhile going down that route because all of this is very, very dynamic. And that means you also then need to think about once you manage to identify what the risks are and use the MIT Risk Taxonomy to do that within the organization, you also then need to think about at a very granular level how you can actually control these. Because my focus is residual risk, how much risk is left over once all of this approach has been deployed. And very helpfully, again, the MIT Risk Repository offers risk mitigations and controls, 831 currently altogether. And you can see the breakdown here. There's a focus on governance and oversight, obviously, transparency, accountability, but also the operational processing, the auditability, and the testing, the red teaming, very important, technical and security. You can see the breakdown here, but this is something your organization must, in my mind, needs to go through if you want to manage AI risks sufficiently and robustly. The traditional methods do not offer this. And again, this is what this little flash and this lightning is here. All of this is very, very dynamic, which then brings me to the sort of last layer in this multi-layered approach, which is what I call the resilience layer. Now, this is driven by the AI black swans. And again, Nassim Taleb, he came up with the black swan idea initially in the more traditional risk space, anti-fragile, fooled by randomness, some really good books if you want to get into the traditional black swan thinking. But in an AI world, in this modern paradigm, the defining black swan characteristics, which are extreme rarity, massive impact, and retrospective predictability, are somewhat overcome by new dimensions of unpredictability. And that to me means we need to move a little bit beyond the Rumsfeld matrix, which was the known knowns, the known unknowns, the unknown unknowns, and so on. We need to think about emergent behaviors, the compounding unknown unknowns, and also accelerated cascading effects that are all caused by these AI black swans that previously really didn't exist like that. And that also means that the traditional risk management frameworks have got shortfalls and gaps when we think about how they can be covered and addressed. Now, from a EW-AiRM benefits perspective, the kind of things where they supersede existing enterprise risk management frameworks are kind of listed here is tenant benefits in my mind. There's probably more, but let's look at taxonomy specificity, for instance. That's very important because you got this granular breakdown with the augmentation of the existing risk management frameworks by the MIT Risk Taxonomy that enables you to, at a very granular level, go through your organization, look at the kind of risks and also then the kind of mitigations and controls that need to be deployed. And if you do it intelligently and smartly, you can actually probably augment this by using some AI systems to do the dynamic and continuous monitoring of your organization. Um, it needs to be tailored towards what you're doing. You need to think about from an integration perspective and come up with a strategy. You need to come up with what I call the KXIs, the key risk, key control, and key performance indicators to measure that and make sure your system is functioning. Now, one of the things the traditional enterprise risk management frameworks did, they looked at this maybe at a quarterly level, maybe at an annual level. In a banks and financial institutions perspective, you got things like the ILAP and the ICAP, so where you look at capital flows, capital adequacy, and also sufficient liquidity. But you do this at a frequent but not continuous perspective. If you're using AI within your organization where you can experience things such as model drift, data drift, model inversion, prompt injections, things like that, you need to continuously monitor that. And the only way you can do that is if you augment what you're doing already with a more dynamic and an agile approach. And you also need to be much more precise in the kind of mitigations and controls you're applying. Now, Markus at the beginning gave us an overview of this global regulatory landscape of pieces that are out there, such as the EU AI Act, the US executive orders, additional papers, a lot of development in Asia and also in China. But that means you need to develop compliance capabilities that are agile enough to address these regulatory requirements because they're still changing. You got the standards out there, the ISOs, the NISTs. That's all very good at giving some classification clarity, but it doesn't mean you can apply this in practice. And it's not good enough to tick some regulatory tick boxes when we don't even know what the tick box looks like. That means you need to build a robust framework for your organization that allows you to support that regulatory agility to move rather quickly depending on what is required. And these are just some of the points here I think that are important, and that's where EW-AiRM is somewhat different. And finally, maybe on this slide, the residual risk focus. Previously, the traditional risk management frameworks focused very much on in-hand risks, but they didn't look at the residual risk portion that is left over after applying all the mitigants and controls. Now, if I'm a board member and I work with boards in a variety of organizations and also sit on a supervisory council, so I'm overseeing the board of an organization, I want to understand where we are within the risk appetite framework and where we exceeding some of these thresholds. The only way you can do that is really if you focus on residual risk and then determine whether some of these thresholds are breached or not, because otherwise it becomes very, very difficult. And obviously the socio-technical scope of this new framework is something that doesn't exist at all in any of the traditional frameworks, and that is brought in by the MIT Risk Taxonomy, by all the different domains and subdomains that need to be considered. So, in summary, I think if your organization is trying or wants to implement AI, you need to think very, very carefully, and you need to think that through from the beginning to the end across the whole life cycle in a dynamic, agile fashion, but you also need to be able to augment. And that brings me to the sort of last slide. Question is then really from an organizational or enterprise perspective, what is actually next? So with my conduct risk hat on, I usually, when I do some of these courses, I say actually doing nothing is also doing something. And Doing nothing, if you want to use AI within your organization, is actually not an option because as a risk manager, and I'm a professional risk manager, you should worry about two key strategic objectives from your organizational perspective. The first one is, and I often ask the CEOs, and CEOs, oh, actually, it's profit, it's making money. No, none of that. The first one is survival, the going concern of your organization. Because if your organization survives and the others, the competitors, die out, then you're doing something right. But it goes further. It's not just survival, it's survival with a long-term sustainable, and then it depends. If you're a corporate organization, I say with a long-term sustainable profit, because you have to make some money, you have to pay your staff, you have to pay your stakeholders, and so on. If you are academic institution, an NGO, some kind of other organization, public sector organization, then I say usually with a long-term sustainable benefit because there is much wider reach of what you're trying to do. Ultimately, it comes back to what's on here. Doing nothing is not an option, so you have to do something. What you shouldn't be doing is you shouldn't be reinventing the wheel. You shouldn't rip out all the existing structures. It's unnecessary. What you should think about is you should think the key strategic foundational pillars, existing EIM frameworks, and then augment them with the stuff that's already out there, that's peer reviewed, that's been researched, that's been very well done by many organizations, such as MIT. If you don't like that, guess what? You could augment it with NIST. You could augment it with ISO. My preferred flavor, my menu option here is the MIT one because the underlying 73, 74 risk management frameworks, AI risk management frameworks, have been very well researched and they all fit into this. But you also need to think about very carefully about mitigants, controls, and then finally the unpredictability of AI black swans and how you can overcome them. You always need to be on top of your game, and it's across the whole life cycle. You can't just say, okay, we buy the system, we implement it, we let it run. That is it. Thank you very much. We can sit back now. It's all self-sustaining and functioning. It's not. Why not? Because tech dynamics require an agile and augmentable risk management approach. And that, I think, is provided, in my mind, certainly, by enterprise-wide AI risk management. You will, or your organization will need it to survive and ultimately to succeed. And with that, all I can say is thank you very much for your attention. I hope you found that worthwhile and engaging, and it gives you a little bit of a background and the backdrop to the origin story where all of this comes from. It's probably a good 10-year period of thinking that ultimately went into that. And when I think, I try to challenge myself quite a bit and tap into others out there as well to challenge that thinking. So a lot of it would have been distributed, somewhat peer reviewed, feedback fed back in. It's not just something on the back of the envelope. There's a lot of thinking that went into it. But I think it's going to work the way it is. And there's going to be two things actually, which I invite you to if you're interested. So the first one is a public course, a one-day course on EW-AiRM in collaboration with the Institute of Risk Management, which is different to the Human AI Institute. The Human AI Institute is something I founded because it supported my work with the United Nations and it was recommended to do it in a what I would call a special purpose vehicle rather than myself as a person, and that's actually worked very, very well. And the outcome delivery was the UNAI declaration. The Institute of Risk Management obviously has been around for several decades, and I've worked with them in the past. They reached out to me and I said, can you offer this as a public course? And I'm going to do that, and I'm very happy to. If you go on their website, the first cohort has sold out very, very quickly, but we've added additional slots and we're likely going to add more to that. And in addition to that, I'm also planning to put all of this thinking into a practical desktop guide slash book on enterprise-wide AI risk management. It's somewhat written already, but I need to go back to it and refine it, get my latest thinking into that, and hopefully that should come out in the later half of 2026. With that, I can see Markus getting a little bit twitchy because there's
No,
probably some
no, I'm
questions.
just curious and interested and just typed in the URL for looking for this course because it's very interesting what you're speaking about. Thank you so much for this
Thank you.
really engaging presentation. Very nice to listen to you. Very interesting thoughts you're bringing up. And as usual, we have now some space for questions before Markus will wrap up the presentation. Anyone wants to ask a question, you can, I think we are currently, you can just share your video and start asking questions. You can also type them in the chat and I can read them. I am always curious by myself. It's of course a very interesting topic, and we are discussing a lot when we bring in new AI tools in our companies and so on. They often ask very early, what's the return of invest? Now you're bringing the risk management into, which is like an additional effort to be done. Like, is there a business value and you mentioned something with thresholds. Is it enough to reach them? Is there a value of exceeding them? Can you quantify that? Is there something possible?
Difficult to quantify as such, particularly when you throw AI into the equation. Having said that, I've seen a really good paper only coming out 2, 3 days ago. This was about the ethical return of investment on AI. I can probably get the link and get it to Markus, and we can share it around in an update email or so. I'm still getting my head around that, but it's certainly worthwhile looking into. Now, as a risk manager for the last 25 years, so back 25 years back, risk managers used to be more like they used to be known as the no department. So the business, the front office, particularly in a bank, financial institution, comes to them, wants to propose a new business, new pitch, new deal, new expansion, new product, and the risk manager would usually look at that, do their analysis, put their analytics hat on, and say, no, no, we can't do that. There's a policy, there's a process. No, we can't do it. My approach to risk management is I see risk management as a strategic business partner slash enabler for two things. And I said this already just now. I talked about the key strategic objectives to an organization. The first one is, if you're an enterprise, you want to survive. You don't want to go bankrupt. You don't want to be exposed to foreclosure or whatever. You want to survive. That's the first one. But I think certainly since the financial crisis, we have seen this short-term incentivization, particularly of investment bankers, hasn't really worked. So the regulators and the organizations themselves build in some sustainability. There needs to be a long-term sustainable horizon there. Risk managers, I guess, are the sort of challengers within the organization, the devil's advocate. When I sit at the board table or when I oversee the board, I'm in the lucky position where I can say, okay, I'm wearing my regulatory hat now. If I was the Bank of England or the PRA or the European Central Bank, and I look at the proposal that you kindly shared with me, I would ask you a range of questions and I will say, why are you doing that? You're very active here. Why do you want to go there? You got very successful products here. Why do you want to go there? Or I would say actually there's a economic, there's a societal need, and it makes sense. But you need to have this exchange because people often, and you find this in big organizations in particular, they are very siloed, they are very tunnel visioned, but that means they're sort of just focusing on the immediate prize or the immediate cat in front of their nose. They don't worry too much what's happening here or what's happening there. They haven't got a good understanding of what's going on in the world, where the geopolitics are moving, where the regulatory environment are moving. So you need to challenge them. But obviously, you can do that in different ways. You can just say in the traditional, so no, we're not going to do that. Or you can say, here's a question for you. If you do that, if you implement this AI system, have you done your maths? How much is it going to cost you? Direct cost. What are the secondary costs? Because if anything goes wrong with it, you will have a massive, big potential reputational risk. As a board member or as an organization, I do not want to be on the front page of the Financial Times because I bought a AI system that all of a sudden ended up declining all the mortgage applications that my customers sent me in, but no reason given. You just go back to the customers and say no. And then if you ask why, it's a bit like Little Britain, that episode with the bank manager. If you ask them, you say, why didn't I get that credit? Computer says no. Well, I'm sorry. That's not good enough explanation. You need to be able to explain the decisions you're making. In banks, financial institutions, or in fact in any organization, you should be very worried about informed decision making. Now, if you take all this decision making and give coming back to what I said earlier on, the autonomy and the agency to your system, that your organization is fully functioning now on steroids with a scalable system and does everything by itself. First of all, why do you need a board? You just let the system make all these decisions. In reality, it ain't going to work like that because things go wrong. They always do. And guess what? You will need a risk manager to come and put out all these burning fires and deal with the phone when the regulator is on the other line and wants to know what the hell is going on here. So, risk managers are the ones that usually cover your backside. They are they are the sort of protective gear in your organization, and they make sure, hopefully, if they do a good job, that you actually survive. That's my answer to your
Very
question.
good. There's another question also in the chat, and to put it a bit in a frame as well, you actually have a lot of experience with a few startups and companies, and maybe some of them, or hopefully all of them, have their risk management in place and AI risk management. But quite often new companies or people who are new in this area, they are struggling and a bit unsure. Should I start engaging and how much will it cost me? How long will it take? And there's a question here, you can see it. Yeah, how much effort in terms of time would it actually take for a standard medium-sized company or maybe even for a big-sized company to apply such a framework?
So the nice thing is because we're augmenting here, we're not changing anything from one day to the next. There isn't going to be a switch over. So you can start with these different layers. The first one would be with the strategic layer. That would mean either myself or some of my consulting colleagues come in-house, spend some time with the board, go through a series of questions, and try to assess where we actually are with these key foundational pillars. That's the first step, and that can take a week, it can take 2 weeks, 3 weeks. How long is a piece of string basically, and how much detail do you want to develop? It could also mean that I develop that I company organization develop a in-house course or deliver the in-house course similar to the one I'm doing publicly for the IRM, and then the organization can go away and build on that themselves because all the tools are available. You've got the framework available, obviously not a book yet, but I'm trying to get this out as soon as possible. My thinking, the MIT risk framework, the MIT risk repository, all of this is available right now. You can go on their website, you can download a Google or Excel spreadsheet and can start cataloging all your risks. You can build an AI risk register. If you have people within your organization that are familiar with these concepts, and I'm thinking about mid to large size organizations, they usually would have an army of compliance people, an army of risk management people. Then you can train them up rather quickly and implement all of this. If you are a small startup with 10 or 20 people, realistically, out of the MIT risk repository, I mean, there's more than 1,600 risks at the moment. I think realistically, you're probably looking at 50 or maybe 100 that would apply to your organization. So you can go through that rather quickly. You need to do this initial exercise once, and then you need to revisit it. Maybe every year or so, and then just maintain it. But you got to start somewhere, and doing nothing isn't an option. It's going to cost you dearly if you miss that. Everything else can be built up. And my thinking at the moment for sort of mid-sized companies, you probably need around 90 to 120 days to implement that. And then the question is, how many consultants do you want to bring in? How do you want to go about doing that? How do you want to structure that project? Do you want to use your in-house team of business analysts and program managers who can support that? Or do you need to hire resources to come externally in to help you with this task? So there's different ways how you can go about it, but it needs to be tailored to an organization. Of course, it's going to cost you, but ultimately, I think it's a worthwhile investment over time because the existing frameworks don't work anymore. And, there's others out there, but they're not easily implementable, I think.
Very good. Yes, I see someone sharing the video. Maybe you also have some question.
Can I?
Of course.
Oh, thank you very much, Markus, for your very insightful intervention. I would like to know if there is some relationships with some standards like ISO 31000 or something else, some other standards for the risk management.
So there's an overlap, and I would always recommend using them as a guideline, whether it's ISO or NIST or even the EU AI Act. And in case of the EU AI Act, you will know this much better than me, Nicola, because you are a data-focused, AI-focused lawyer. There will be legal requirements to do this kind of stuff, but as a risk manager, I would say actually we need to involve the organization's legal team now to make sure whether this is a opposite, if it's a prohibited system, then you shouldn't be doing it. That's fairly simple. That's a binary answer. Are you using this system? Yes. Is it forbidden? Yes. Well, then you can't use it. Simple. If it's a high risk system, then you need to be a little bit more mindful how you implement that. But ultimately, the foundation around all of this is, or the what would I say? The demarcation is the legal requirements first. So that's the EU AI Act. That's some of the other legal pieces that are out there. And then the standards give you a fairly good idea of what you could be doing, but the standards realistically aren't that practically implementable yet. So if you look at ISO 31, not ISO 31, well, you can take ISO 31,000. You've got definitions of what risk is. You got definitions of what controls mitigants are, but they don't get you anywhere necessarily in an AI space. Then you got ISO 42,000 and the series around that. That still doesn't give you that level of granularity that you would achieve with the MIT Risk Repository. And the MIT Risk Repository, because it's based on 73, 74 peer-reviewed frameworks, there has been a lot of thinking going into this already. I'm not saying it hasn't gone into standards, because, you could argue the declaration that I worked on for Unit C is somewhat equivalent, I guess, to a standard or certainly to a guideline. And that went through different review procedures. It underwent two public consultations. It involved a global working group of experts and a lot of deliberation, a lot of arguments. It involved me reaching out to Professor Stuart Russell, very well known in the AI space, to discuss with him at a bilateral level what the OECD were going to do as part of their AI principles, because I wanted to align my AI declaration for the UN definition of AI systems with what they were going to do as much as it's possible. Because the reason is, as much as we talk about standards, a lot of this is about really having tools for communications. If we don't have a aligned narrative, aligned syntax and taxonomy across the organization, and not just across the organization, but also intra and inter organizations, how else can we achieve an alignment and a congruence on making sure this is all going to work? Because everyone else got their own definitions, everyone else got their own understanding of what AI is, what systems are, what controls are. That's not going to work because you need to see, I see risk management, actually, that's why I said business enabler, as a communication tool to bridging that gap between the technology teams, the management team, the leadership team, and also the shop floor to getting people all on board saying, actually, we all working on the same goals, organizational goals. We want to succeed in business and we want to survive because frankly, if we don't survive, then we haven't got a job anymore with this organization. So that's pointless. There needs to be some continuity, some going concern. And the only way we can do that is if we deploy whatever tools are out there that are deployable. So standards, worthwhile looking at them, not easily accessible, as you will know, particularly the ISO standards, you actually have to pay for quite a bit of money if you want to access the document. Okay, you have to buy a book for EW-AiRM, but that's minute compared to the costs that you would have to pay for a standard. And then you need to think about how to implement that as well, and it needs to be implementable. Now, it turns out standards are not necessarily the most practical tools because you still need checklists, templates, approaches. You need to translate all of this stuff into what does it actually mean on the shop floor? What does it mean in the engine room? How do you implement it? And the standards don't go far enough in my mind. So there's much more needed, but they're very important.
Thank you very much.
You're welcome.
As you might know, in INNS, we also have this AI law and regulations section, and that section is on already for a few years organizing workshops and special sessions in INNS. And one issue there was always how can people from tech speak together with people from law, regulation, and whatsoever. I think you're facing these problems as well. In your presentation, you kept it rather simple. I think it was very well understandable for a rather broad audience. But do you have these issues? Do you confront them somehow? Do you have some good ways how to make people able to listen to each other and understand each other?
They before I done work for the UN, there used to be already a story of my professional life, I would say, because I always worked at the sort of cusp between technology and business and management, and there's obviously a sort of natural triangle. There's opposing views, and the only way you can move forward is if you overcome these. We see this a little bit in the geopolitical space at the moment. I don't want to say the G word, but I say an icy land and what's going on there. But then, obviously, as part of the work with the UN, I think I've adopted a little bit more of, I guess, a diplomatic approach, I would say. And that means I need to be in a position, that's why I say I'm wearing different hats, I need to be in a position in the work I do, particularly at a strategic board level, to put myself into other people's shoes to understand their perspective. So if I sit in a board meeting where a new product, whether it's crypto, stablecoin, or whatever, is presented to me, I need to be able to wear the shoes of the CEO, the board, the product people who want to push this out into the market and want to expand. But then I also need to be able to wear the regulator's hat and understand how they would be looking at it. I need to wear to a lesser extent, maybe the legal hat, the compliance hat, the risk management hat. But also then I need to understand from a technology perspective, how does this thing actually work? Because if I don't understand how it works, I won't be able to assess and quantify the risks that come with it. So if you want to do that, you need to be able to switch your views and take a multilateral view and different perspectives. And the only way this works is really if you cut across these barriers, these borders, these different languages. You will understand this, Markus. I think you German originally as well, but you've been living in, I think, Sweden for a long time. If you immerse yourself in a different environment, whether it's a cultural environment, a business environment, or a different philosophical thinking environment, then you soak up those ideas. But hopefully, if you open enough, you can build bridges. And I think it's about building these bridges within the organization, but also across organizational borders, across national and country borders and geopolitical borders, because otherwise you just end up in potentially full out conflict. Now, nobody wants that because it comes back to this idea of survival, what's needed. And I think there's room for everyone to survive, whether that's within the organization or outside of those. But it's that diplomatic approach and pragmatic approach that's very, very important, I think, in my mind.
The final question, and that might be a bit more. It's not coming from me originally. I've been tasked to ask you, but will we have soon AI methods, tools, which will take over, applying these frameworks which you are here currently explaining, so that we don't have to dive into these handbooks and regulations?
Well, I was going to say, I hope not. I would go further. I would say, I think not, because if you come back to one of the earlier slides I mentioned, where I was talking about agency and autonomy, one of the important pieces is actually to making sure that humans stay in control. If we hand all of this over to the machine, then I think we are probably looking towards some extinction type scenario where AI might be just taking over our lives and do everything for us. I don't think that's desirable. So I can't really support that. At the framework level, my hope would be that we may be coming up with some sort of tools that allow me to answer the question of one of the attendees earlier, to get the implementation horizon down. And the way I could be doing this is I could potentially, and there's likely the restrictions of the organization or the enterprise we work with, I could run the whole corporate body of knowledge. So the combination of policies, processes, desktop procedures, documentations, internal models, Excel sheets, whatever they use, everything across an AI tool that doesn't exist yet, and say, okay, if I throw all of this stuff in, run my analytical tool, what sort of recommendations would it come out with? Sort of a recommender engine that says, okay, we looked at your entire organization now. Based on that very detailed granular analysis we did, we are suggesting you not worrying enough about the ethical filter. You aren't thinking about it from an environmental perspective. You could be improving your return on investment by cutting down your environmental costs by not using this full-scale large language model. You could be using a desk-based small language model that doesn't require all of this cloud-based. All these things we don't think about. So I think there is an augmentation possible, but that tool doesn't exist yet. Ideally, I'd like the idea where I say, okay, I've got an organization calling me saying, I want to implement enterprise-wide AI risk management. How can I do that? And I send them a link. I say, dump all your organizational information in there. My tool runs. It provides recommendations, it comes up with detailed frameworks, templates, whatever, and then it sends the invoice. So from my perspective, this whole thing becomes very scalable, and I could have an AI that runs it for me. And if you think of all the organizations around the globe who want to potentially implement that, that could be very lucrative, and I could probably retire now. But unfortunately, that doesn't exist yet, and I don't think it will exist for some time.
And you really brought up something which is very important. We need to maintain the human agency. At the very beginning, you mentioned that. And I think there are no further questions. Do you have some concluding remarks?
Nothing specifically other than I will gladly provide a PDF of the slides with a much more detailed appendix. I need to work through that a little bit. I will provide that through the INNS Secretariat, and hopefully you can make that available for the participants. Then otherwise, you can find me on LinkedIn. I also would encourage you, if you like, to follow the Human AI Institute on LinkedIn. And I don't know if the enterprise-wide AI risk management link you very kindly posted.
This is the one to your course.
Yeah, so that's the thematic page for all of this work. I've published an article there. There's going to be more coming out. And obviously, there's going to be additional information out there. If you have any questions, reach out to me. Be patient with me. I get a lot of those, so I might not be always as responsive. But keep an eye out what's happening in this space. And obviously, if you're really interested, the Institute of Risk Management public course is still taking attendees for, I think, the 18th or 19th of March and the 21st of May at the moment. There's likely going to be added more, but that hasn't been decided yet. And I also have now interest from some organizations to deliver that as an in-house course already. So I think it's going to be a very busy year, very exciting. And I would like to thank INNS and the opportunity to present today, also finally managed to get this clarity in my own head by thinking through all of this and developing these slides, where I'm feeling comfortable now that this is something actually that's going to work like this. And because there's so much dynamism in this space, this will naturally develop and evolve over time. But I think for the time being, I'm very happy that we have this and where we are. And I'd like to see it being used in practice actually by some organizations, which may happen very, very soon.
Yeah, thank you so much, Markus, and thank you again also, Nicola, for suggesting Markus as a speaker. That was really an honor to have you here. It was amazing to have you as a speaker. I will now give a short wrap-up of this presentation. First of all, to mention again that presentation was organized by the International Neural Network Society, and you can follow this society by clicking on inns.org, and you have here also the URL, but you will get the link also from the website to see our current and past webinars and all the recordings. The next webinar title has already been decided. It will be on Hexor, CNS substrate of skilled behavior, elasticity ensuring stability. So very interesting from a very different and more neurological, logical angle, looking into neural networks. And Jonathan Wolpath will give this presentation. Will be somewhere in the next months, not clear yet exactly the date, but you can see on the website once it's decided. Furthermore, join also the INNS community. There are soon a lot of awards, as every year INNS giving lifetime achievements awards in several areas for different types of contributions in, for example, the more biological aspects and others. You see these awards here. Also, Young Investor Awards and Young Investigator Awards are given. And there is still some time until the 1st of April, but it's not so much anymore. So if you have ideas of people who contributed really significantly towards neural networks, and it does not necessarily need to be someone who was organizing a neural networks conference from INNS. These awards are globally given to people who have really contributed to research in the area of neural networks from different perspectives. So nominate people. Nomination deadline is in the 1st of April this year. Furthermore, I'm really looking forward. Now it's just 5 months left and we will have the chance to physically engage with each other. This time we will meet in Maastricht in the Netherlands, and there will be not just the International Joint Neural Networks Conference, but it will be in conjunction with 2 other conferences in a bigger scope of the World Congress on Computational Intelligence. I hope you have already ideas to submit. The submission deadline is very soon. So submit some papers to the World Congress and join us to exciting live keynote presentations, in-person discussions, and many other seminars, plenary discussions. Very exciting event. All of our board members will be there. Join our community, join the next webinar, and join us at Wiki 2026. Thank you very much.